So yeah, I wanted to talk about zombies a little bit. Now, I have to explain a little bit about how I came to talk about zombies. I got a PhD in anthropology in 2012, and I have to admit that I hate the field of anthropology. I think it's done a lot of damage to communities and a variety of other things that I don't trust it. So, as a recent graduate of a PhD program, I was facing the prospect of how do I teach introduction to anthropology or anything like that when I don't like the field, when I see some of the damages and harms it's caused. And it occurred to me that one of the things that I could do was I could help students learn how to think anthropologically without bringing real people into the situation. And zombies somehow struck me as the perfect vehicle to do this. I have to admit that I never imagined I'd be doing something like this at BSU as a kid or anywhere I've been. Little me never saw this as a potential future. I never had a high school guidance counselor tell me this was a career possibility. But I do have to admit that zombies have figured pretty heavily into my personal development as a person, as a human being, largely from seeing things like Night of the Living Dead at far too young of an age, courtesy of my uncle's top-loading VCR in the basement of my grandparents' house down in Blaine, Minnesota. And it was one of those things where I recognized something in that kind of horror that resonated with my sense and my beingness living in the city. The isolation, the anonymity of the enemy, and then the prospect of seeing this African-American hero survive the night of the living dead and ending up getting killed by an all-white posse early the next morning really stuck with me as an image, as a feeling of just that kind of existential horror of being afraid of just being erased that easily. And so I saw a bunch of stuff that just sort of set me on this course of becoming a horror fan. It struck me that a lot of the media that we have in our lives and in our experience, okay. All right. But I came to notice, like, even at a young age, how the stuff that we were consuming in terms of video games and movies and things were reflecting a lot of things about our culture, about the culture that we were immersed in, I guess I should say. And I started to see how zombie films could be used as a site to critique colonialism in particular, because I immediately recognized how there was some sort of parallel between how zombies were depicted in video games and on screen with how Indians were portrayed in other similar medias, in old Westerns and in video games, as just this unrelentlessly violent, primitive horde that has to be eliminated so that the hero can ride off into the sunset, sort of a thing. And I started to see, as a consequence of my training as an anthropologist, how I could apply social scientific theories to the analysis of these films as literature, but also as cultural artifacts. And I admit that I didn't really like what I saw then. I was seeing how, like, old school social scientific theories like social Darwinism, unilineal evolutionism, and these things that were really racist to their cores were still shaping how people who were othered in American society are being treated and depicted on screen and in video games and in literature and all of that. But then that also lets me talk about those theories in a way without denigrating actual living people. And so zombies in particular are like the perfect colonial vehicle to discuss this stuff, because zombies themselves come out of a colonial context. It comes out of the Caribbean. It comes out of this conglomeration of indigenous and African and European belief systems in the Caribbean, which mix together all sorts of elements of primitivity and superstition and racism, tied to beliefs about where people belong in terms of a social hierarchy, how they are objects of horror because of their wrong skin color, and ultimately underneath all of those things in the context of the Caribbean, the fear of a slave uprising. right? So people's labor was seen as something that should be under the control of a white zombie master. But there's always that fear that there's going to be an uprising and that order will be upset. And so throughout zombie representations up to this day, one of the hallmarks of their depiction is how they have no will of their own, have no volition. They're under control either of a master, the old school zombie representations from like the 1930s and 40s and stuff, or in more contemporary representations, they are controlled by their appetites, their need, their drive to consume. In either case, they have no will of their own. All right, now Zombieland in particular strikes me as an example of some pretty old school ideas of how American identity has been formed. In 1893, the president of the American Historical Association gave a talk at the Chicago World's Expo. And the timing of this is important. 1893 is 3 years after the massacre of Wounded Knee. 1893 is 3 years after the closing of the American frontier. And there was a lot of anxiety at that time as to how the country was going to make more Americans in the absence of the frontier as a site of violence, and the crucible of that identity and value formation for the country. And I'll talk a little bit more about Frederick Jackson Turner's ideas, even as I acknowledge how they are very dated and they've not held up well to historical or psychological scrutiny, but they still, in many ways, are evident in the types of media that we consume. Now, zombies are, of course, the ultimate other, right? They are not alive, they're not quite dead. They engage in all kinds of behaviors that are deemed irrational and violent and out of control. So they're the ultimate primitive being. And this requires a violent management, right? And this is what the heroes do in these media, is they kill as many of them as possible. It's the only way to survive. It's just kill and kill and kill. And through the rebirth of zombie film with Romero in 1968, what we see is basically a siege film where you've got these people that are holed up in a farmhouse in the country, and it looks like an old Western movie where it's like the stagecoach surrounded by Indians, or like Rio Bravo with the guys holding out in the town jail trying to hold off the hordes of Indians. And so these echoes are important, and they show just how necessary it is to interpret zombie media through the lens of Indigenous criticism and the logics of colonialism. Now, I admit social theories have a bit of a shelf life, and as I said, Frederick Jackson Turner hasn't really borne any fruit for quite some time. But in the popular discourses, they still serve some explanatory and even motivational power. They motivate heroes to do things in our everyday thing. We see this same story of this frontier-style hero having to clear the landscape of a problem population played out in all kinds of movies. I think every video game I've ever played has the same logic, where you have to clear a problem population and steal all this stuff and get rich and discover new lands and all that sort of thing gets played out. So this notion of violent conflict against a problematic other it shows how the zombies have become a still acceptable minority that you commit genocide against. And now one of the things about the creation of some other on which you project everything you think is wrong with humanity, that projection reveals how you think about yourself. Projections often say more about the people who are doing the projection than it does about the people that they're trying to describe. And that's exactly what happens in anthropology. They're looking for answers in other societies, and instead they're thinking about their own problems and finding those solutions elsewhere. These zombies are relegated to the position of being this ultimate other against which the self defines himself and then rediscovers and reinvents himself as a person. So it's that same frontier mentality that Frederick Jackson Turner was talking about in 1893. And this is a repeating performance of the same sort of rugged individualism that characterizes all kinds of frontier imaginations of the Old West, and the equal and and his own equal imagination of how it takes somebody who is able to commit that kind of violence in order to maintain order and keep the world safe for civilization, that we see in Zombieland, and we actually also see in recent court cases about racialized vigilante justice. It's the very same stories being played out. At any rate, zombies do not count as people in these films. And that ease with which we can dehumanize an entire population and then justify their eradication, the very logic of genocide. This is following, I'm thinking of Giorgio Agamben, who talks about homo sacer, who's this person, this role in society where it's a person can be killed, but you can't ever call it murder because they have no rights. They don't deserve to exist. They don't count, right? And so the recognition of a crime as being murder demands that that victim be deemed somehow human, and there's absolutely no way you are allowed to count a zombie as human, in much the same way for a long time. It was even in some places against the law to count indigenous peoples as human beings. So zombies are not real in the same way that indigenous peoples were deemed not real to the same ends, so that we could kill them all. In Zombieland, to be a person or to be a people means that they are the only ones that have any recognizable claims to life, liberty, and property. And you lose all those rights by becoming a zombie. You lose the right to exist by becoming a zombie, and that's the struggle, right? So the characters in the movie Zombieland, like the viewers of the film, are placed in the position of being in that dominating role over zombies. You're supposed to identify with the heroes, justify or excuse the violence necessary to figure out what's going to carry out with the plot, right? And so this sets up the critique of Zombieland as being a colonial artifact, because it's at that frontier boundary that this kind of genocidal violence is not just expected, but it's excused. This is what we see on the screen. I promise this is the end of my total nerdiness, and we're gonna talk about the film here. All right, so in Zombieland, the central character is this dude who's called Columbus. Now they have this thing where they don't actually use real names. They talk about where they're from, and that's the name, right? And now, as a native person, when I hear the word Columbus, there's a whole bunch of associations that I automatically make. So that sort of set me on the path of interpretation for this film. And we find Columbus in his basically his college dormitory, surrounded by pizza boxes and Mountain Dew Code Red, playing World of Warcraft, which many of you might be too young to remember what that is. But it's an online massive role-playing game. And it's largely associated with being super nerdy, super isolated, and probably key to this film, totally absent of masculinity. And he says, that his isolation as a video gamer and somebody who's not very successful with women prepared him for survival in Zombieland, because he was already isolated and he believed he could. The only way to survive Zombieland is not to trust anybody, not to let anybody in. And he was already used to that. That his whole life, all I ever wanted was to find a girl and fall in love, bring her home to meet the folks. Then again, my folks are a couple of paranoid shut-ins like me. Maybe this girl could bring me home to her folks, and then I'll finally be a member of a cool, functional family. That he's all alone in this situation. Then we meet Tallahassee, who's making his way across Texas. And again, Tallahassee is where he's from, so that's not his real name. Tallahassee is the hypermasculine, unsophisticated, violent frontier hero, kind of like Daniel Boone or John Wayne sort of figure, ready to deal out all kinds of violence in all kinds of very spectacular ways. And he's constantly policing Columbus's masculinity, calling him feminized slurs and all kinds of things like that. They eventually meet up with these girls, a woman called Wichita and a 12-year-old that they call Little Rock. And they figure out that they have to unite to survive after some struggle. They don't trust each other. They're having problems, right? The women have decided they're not going to trust anybody. They're just going to pair up, and there's all the hypermasculine isolation on the other side. But eventually, Columbus gets mad. He wants a family. He sees them sniping at each other like this, and he says, And I got to censor this. There's enough already. We've been chased by ravenous freaks. Don't we have enough problems? Get over it, okay? Can't we just drive down the road playing I Spy or something for 2 hours like some normal Americans? Right? And so this repetition of what it is to be American keeps coming up in the film. And they're on their way to Pacific Playland. They decide to unite and go west. So again, it's a replay of the Frederick Jackson Turner frontier hypothesis quite literally at this point. They recognize that there's a common enemy that they face, zombies, for which the country is named after at this point, and a place to go, which is west, where all their dreams will supposedly come true and it's safe. Along the way, come across an Indian gift shop. There's this ridiculous statue of an Indian caricature with a sign that says, "We want them, you want them." And they go in and they just destroy the place in mostly a crisis of masculinity that then they spread on to the girls. And this becomes part and parcel of a new rule that our character develops, which is you have to enjoy the little things, even if it means destroying a bunch of little things. So this is already a denigration of everything that is represented in this gift shop. Now, I have to admit that it's just a gift shop. Itchy, it's ridiculous, it's cheap stuff, it's not authentic or sacred or whatever, but the beliefs are still there that this is at this point the only representation we have of Indigenous people, even though there's not people here either. So this orgy of destruction sets off this unifying moment for this group. It so brings them together. They leave the shop and they end up going towards Pacific Playland. And this is what brings them together as a family for Columbus. And they end up, the final confrontational scene happens when Columbus has to go and rescue the girls because they get stuck on a ride called Blast Off. And this, to my mind, strikes me as like the perfect application of the frontier hypothesis, because they're literally here at the final frontier going off into space. So this is where all my Star Trek stuff is like, oh my gosh. And so the final frontier from Star Trek, as well as even Kennedy's promise of a new frontier during his presidential run in 1960. So Columbus and Tallahassee follow them, find them if they're in trouble and rescue them. So again, it's like the whole video game thing. We have to go rescue the princess. And this all happens. So now, concurrent with the closure of the frontier, Indigenous people ceased to be a military threat to the United States, allegedly, and fighting natives had to become turned into something else. And the thing that it turned into was playing Indian. The other thing that happened in the late 19th century was the creation of things like the Boy Scouts and other secret societies of men and boys who would go out into the wilderness, and if they couldn't literally fight Indigenous peoples, they would pretend to have those very same survival experiences, and even the reenactment of wars and Indian wars and all that. So to play Indian, to replace Indians. And this is important to note when we look at the characters in this movie. It's Columbus, yeah. But it's Wichita, it's Tallahassee, it's Little Rock. These are Indian names. So there's a story of replacement going on here. And that these are Indian names shows how the claiming of a connection to a land, the claiming of a new identity, the forging of this new American personality from this frontier violence has taken on the aesthetics of indigeneity, has taken on Indian names. We can call a Jeep Cherokee, or an Apache helicopter, or do any of these sorts of things, and they don't threaten the racial order of the United States at all. Whereas if the opposite ever happens, you have an Indigenous person speaking English, wearing button-up shirts and giving talks at BSU, then my identity can be called into question very easily. So this need to deny humanity on the part of this ultimate other is what fuels all of this personality development for these characters in the very same way that it forged the American personality, according to Frederick Jackson Turner. And if you think of the very first lines in the movie of Zombieland, he's just like, "Oh, America, I wish I could say that this was still America, but I've come to realize you can't have a country without people, and there are no people here." Right? Columbus's journey to begin it all, first he must fully dehumanize the zombies. They are not people. Then that justifies their destruction. That excuses their destruction, that demands their destruction. And even though, as Turner states, since the days when the fleet of Columbus sailed into the waters of the New World, America has been another name for opportunity, and the people of the United States have taken their tone from the incessant expansion, which has not only been open, but has even been forced upon them. They have no choice but to commit this violence. This explains and excuses all the violence that occurs to the point where in the end, as they're driving off into the sunset, after having rescued the girls and defeated the zombies of Pacific Playland, at the end when Columbus says, "Even though life would never be simple or innocent again, we had hope and we had each other, and without other people, well, you might as well be a zombie." So at that point, the ideational and practical violence that they have committed up to that point is excused. But it also shows how the very same innocence that's claimed by an American identity that excuses all these kinds of genocidal violences that made America necessary, similarly excused and forgotten. Thank you for listening to me nerd out about a really old zombie movie. I do welcome any questions in the chat. I can kind of see it off and on. So, Coach Bizendaliak. Questions? And oh, there's two hands. Yes. Oh, what year did Zombieland come out? I think it was 2008 or 9. Yeah, and over there. Oh, what inspired me to do this research? Well, I loved zombie movies. And at some point, I just became a habitual overthinker. And actually, honestly, a part of it was trying to figure out my own experience in the world. You know, why is it always so hard? Why are people like this? And it's because these are the stories that we tell over and over and over again, or that we hear over and over and over again. And people who are othered in those stories face the consequences of those stories over and over and over again. I think part of it is me trying to find the root of it. That maybe we can get rid of it and tell ourselves new stories that aren't quite so destructive. Yeah. There's my elder here talked about his own experience here at Bemidji, still facing racism, still facing people primitive, being treated in honorable subhuman fashion, and that's true. That's real. I think that's one of the reasons why I try to do this kind of work, right? Because I'm in Indigenous studies. When I say that, people think, well, you teach about Indians. And I don't. I teach about colonialism. I teach about the problems that colonialism has foisted upon the world, which means I get to talk about Zombieland. I get to talk about Frederick Jackson Turner. I get to talk about these ideas that were used to justify all kinds of violences. Because that is a necessary recognition that it's their problem. They made it our problem, and we suffered the consequences of the problem, and we died and are continuing to die because of the problem. But it's not our invention. That's the story they're spinning out, justify the ongoing violences and genocide to this day. I acknowledge that, yeah, this stuff is 2021 and we still hear these things. 2021 and people are still awful to each other because of racism, anti-indigeneity, and all those sorts of things. But I also see increasingly young people talking about these things in a very serious way. And even people who hate us are talking about this in ways that are different than they were 20 some years ago. Because I remember sitting in a cafe in Montana, at breakfast in a hotel, hearing guys talking about how they wanted the Landusky mine to be reopened. This is a mine that turned a mountain a hole in the ground and poisoned the aquifer with cyanide. You couldn't touch the water. They were like, I hope they open the mine again. I'm listening. One of the guys is like, yeah, but we can't do that because that's a sovereign nation over there. But even the fact that they could say that meant that they learned something. They're still horrible racist people, but they learned something. And that changed how they even talked about the issue. I really hate championing like incremental changes. Sometimes that's where the hope lies. I know my experience coming home to Bemidji is a lot different than it was the first time I started hanging around here in the 90s. Better than they used to be. Not much, honestly. I think they are. So I acknowledge that, yeah, we have these horrible experiences, but things have gotten better, you know, comes in spite of. Right, yeah. So Anna's bringing up that one of the other things that is very common in zombie films, that there's a conflict between individualism on one hand and collectivism on the other, where mostly individualism is celebrated and then the necessary stance for a hero to defeat this mindless horde, this collectivity. This collective often doesn't have an individual identity at all, right? Especially in the old Westerns. But there's the irony of things go bad for the surviving humans because they fail to cooperate, don't get their stuff together. Bad stuff happens, right? So there is a bit of a critique already built in to, you know, you can't go either way, really. But that's not very common, that kind of internal critique of, well, you need to figure out how to balance individualism and collectivism in order to cooperate. That doesn't happen as often as it should. But that's because the very story that colonialism tells us, be an individual. Everything that colonization did to indigenous people in the world was to break every kind of relationship that we had. Land, relationship to language, relationship to our religion and spirituality, relationship to each other, the definition of family, the definition of marriage, and the imposition of citizenship, private land ownership, turn us all into citizens. So that pressure to break everybody down to just single unit of capital L liberalism, enlightenment, where everything is about individual rights, that's a problem. Some authors have tried to address this. Like I've read things about how they hope to someday see a zombie film where the survivors voluntarily become zombies because there's kind of liberation there. You don't, not alone anymore. And some have teased towards that. I've seen some films that, I've seen way too many zombie movies, as you can tell. I've seen some that tease towards that, but not very well. Again, that's a fundamental worldview understanding of what a person is that colonization teaches up against. Hard to get around. Somebody asked about Avatar. Avatar, some people say Avatar has similar racist colonialist overtones. What do you think? Avatar is one of 2 films I've ever seen in my life that made me want to vomit. That's what I think about that. Avatar is totally Dances with Wolves in space. I literally got sick watching it. And what made it even worse for me, because it's the same sort of, well, there's 2 things to say. One good thing about Avatar, that's, you know, you've got the Na'vi, these indigenous peoples to this other planet, and you got the people who are interfering with them, military, and missionaries, schools, social workers. They're both bad guys. They're equally bad. They're equally agents of colonialism. That's the only good thing I can say about Avatar. The other thing that really dug into me in watching Avatar was realization that, yeah, the Na'vi win at the end. That's only possible on another planet. That was heartbreaking. Day is asking me about Dune. I haven't seen the new one. I read the books, like first book, a lot. I saw the David Lynch version. Dune has kind of the same sort of, I guess, straight up orientalizing things, like in the Edward Said sort of way. Frank Herbert was influenced by American indigenous peoples in his writings, and on among the Pacific Northwest tribes, saw in them a new future. Science fiction, right? Which happens in anthropology too. But the whole notion of you got this special guy who can go to the indigenous peoples of Arrakis and learn to be the best person of them. It's very, yeah, it is. It's very Dances with Wolves. It's very Avatar. So it's the very same sort of ideals. The special colonizer guy who can go native, not just become the best native there is, but then becomes the best colonizer too. Oh, Tori asked, what's the other movie that made me barf? It was actually a documentary on the cartoonist Robert Crumb called Crumb. Vomit. Tori wants to unmute to ask a question. I don't know if is that possible? Let's see if it is. Let's see if it works.
Hello.
Hey, I can hear you.
Okay, I turned on video as well, but I just wanted to, well, hello again, Chad. It's been a while.
Yeah.
And I, it's not really a question so much as, I guess, a statement, and maybe just to say thank you. So I took your class like 100 years ago at UVic about this topic. And it's funny because like I've thought about it a lot over the years since, and now I work as a street level nurse in an area that's been really badly hit by the overdose crisis. And just watching you give this talk today, like my brain is just like going in overdrive because the things that you're saying, like this idea of the zombies as the ultimate other. Like I serve a community now that are often characterized as zombies. They have this like ceaseless appetite. They're controlled by this appetite. The moral panic that drug users cause like the city I live in to just like go complete, like to lose their minds, basically. It's really something else. And even when you said earlier, you know, you lose your right to live by becoming a zombie. I feel like there's so many parallels between what you were saying today and the work that I find myself doing now. So thank you for, I guess, rearranging my brain, like again, because you did this to me a few years back when I took your zombie course. So thank you. And right. Feel free to add to
that. Good to hear from you. I'm glad you're doing the work. Yeah, I mean, I've sort of seen what you're doing by like Facebook and stuff. I'm glad to see you here, and yeah, I'm glad to have been a small part of what you're doing, because what you're doing makes me proud. I think colonialism, as in one group of conquering another, is a basic human vice, one that has and probably will continue to cause irreparable human pain and suffering. No, I do not. There are examples of the archaeological record, which I hate to point to, of locations on the planet of actually cooperating multicultural societies that managed to get along without having to kill each other, without having to take over lands, without having to take over resources, without having to do any of the sorts of sins that we associate with colonialism. Happened here and there. Problem is, of course, colonialism at the moment that it occurs, which we can place into all kinds of, historical circumstances, technological developments and whatever, had a lot of guns, a lot of germs, a lot of circumstances that helped its success, helped its strategies happen, and also at the very same time, make it look natural, make it look inevitable. And I don't believe it was. I think it was a particular bad idea with roots that are a few thousand years old that grew into a monster at a particular point in time, and it will go away. I believe it will go away. One of the best lessons I ever had was from a tribal historian down in Tama. They're Meskwaki, and the Meskwaki were, I think, one of the only tribes in the country where a European nation outright declared a war of genocide against them. France just said, we're going to kill them all. This guy's like, yeah, the French came, went away, chased them all the way down the Mississippi, firing arrows every step of the way. Spanish were here, they're gone. British were here, they're gone. Americans are here now, and they're going to go away too. That's a kind of perspective doesn't get talked about a whole lot. Perspective that this is not natural, this is not a part of human nature, this is not inevitable. The consequences of people's actions, and choices, and stories. We really need to tell a different story. They're telling different stories right now, trying to save the planet. Still people who will not listen might lose a little bit of money, a little bit of power, or something. That's the real tragedy. So the question is, do I think that zombie movies help perpetuate that unnatural story? Domination and oppression and violence. That's a good question that I wrestle with a lot, right? Because it's like, how do I share this stuff with my kids? And I remember showing one of my kids Dawn of the Dead. I was like right there, like pausing. Hey, he just said this. What do you think is going to happen next? Like trying to like really turn it into a narrative, points of intervention. But I think in that way, even this problematic media that we're talking about, zombie movies and videos, can be points of intervention. Even though, yeah, I think mindless consumption of this stuff does perpetuate the problem, because too few people actually look at it and realize it's all the same story. Every video game, all these zombie movies, Avatar, Dances with Wolves, won't catch it. I think once people catch it, can't unsee it. That's the best I can do. Help some students walk out of my classroom and notice points of, oh, that's not natural. That's not inevitable. That's not real. That's propaganda. Then that's the beginning of a new story. Have you studied, I have my glasses on because they fog up when I wear a mask. Have you studied colonialism in other parts of the world, such as Brazil? If so, do you have any observations to make about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the US? I don't know what diversity means. I don't like inclusion. Equity, I'm on the fence about. I have looked a little bit at Brazil. I mean, there's interesting overlaps with zombies in Brazil because of the whole like Quilombo uprisings throughout Brazil, and even like the name connected to zombie, connected to samba, you know, and all these sorts of associations of racialized hierarchies and fears of loss of power. A lot of stuff going on in Brazil about that. But that's all I can say about Brazil right now, other than I kind of like Sepultura as a band. Do you have any diversity, equity, and inclusion in the US? It's, I don't know. Once you can label it, you're done. I don't like definitions. I don't like single words. And reduce the problem to even 3 words, diversity, equity, and inclusion. You're just beginning to think about the actual problem. Either we need to figure out what those words mean in a real dialogue, or up on the words and actually just deal with practice. I don't like inclusion. I don't like inclusion because everything about colonization was trying to include indigenous peoples, but on their terms, not ours. I don't know what diversity means. It means whatever people want it to mean. Equity, though, that might have some legs. Are we done? All right, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you all out in Zombieland.